Good morning and welcome to part 2 of Ireland, its people and its history. The last time we were here, we covered a period from 12,500 BC up to the year 1059, a long period of time. However, today we're going to really cover a relatively short period. Boy, I can't see my notes at all now.
Your eyes will adjust in just a moment.
We're going to cover a relatively short period of time up until the beginning of the 1700s. We begin today by looking at the map that we closed with at our last session. By 1069, Brian Boru, the High King of England, drove out the Norsemen from Ireland, who were located down here, Waterford, Wexford, and up to Dublin. They left in Ireland at that point in time. The Irish people controlled all the lands of the country. This is significant, as you will see, because shortly thereafter, things started to change and became rather dramatic for the Irish. Pope Adrian, a wondrous story. Most of you know that Ireland was Catholic. Pope Adrian was an English and the only English Pope of the Roman Catholic Church. And in 1055, he issued what is called a Bill of Lauterbelter. Translated, it means go in there and straighten up those Catholics. You have to understand that the Roman Church expected homage and mostly monies. And the Irish people weren't into giving monies to Rome, nor did they follow exactly the Roman theology as they continued to pay homage to leprechauns, elves, druids, and occasionally went to church. So Adrian said to the King of England, go in and straighten them up. It took 2 more years until Henry II, not the first, sorry about that, went into Ireland, up from the southern part and into Dublin, which he captured with the intent of helping the King of Leinster, who had asked him to come into Ireland and recapture lands that had been taken away from him by the High King O'Rourke. Unfortunately, it didn't turn out too well for MacMacherda, who was the King of Leinster, because when Henry got to Dublin, he says, I claim this as a colony of England. And hence began occupation of Ireland that continues to this very day. You have to really think about Ireland in the same way as the United States when the Pilgrims arrived at Plymouth Rock all there were these tribes across the United States. And the English practice then, as in Ireland, was the same. Simply drive them out, get rid of them, take their lands, and use it for our own good. As Henry accomplished this, he also saw an incredible influx of English to the countryside of Ireland. However, they really weren't free to just simply come in and settle, because there was so much Irish animosity that they built these walled towns across pretty much all of Ireland, except, as you will see, this area up here. It becomes pretty important as we continue to talk today, because the land is similar to the kind of land we've given our Western United States Indians. No one else wanted it, so that was a good place for them to go. And this ultimately was the same for the Irish Catholics. But during this period of time, when these walled towns were built, from the year 1200 to 1400, there was incredible growth in Ireland, not only because of the influx of the Irish or the English, but the harvests were good. These towns created a place for the farmers to conduct commerce. For the first time, they were making money, and so the birth rate increased dramatically. And this also coincided with a vaccine for smallpox. Very similar to what's going on in our country right now, but it had a profound effect, especially on the death of young children back in the days. In this period of 12 to 1400, we saw a proliferation of both castles and churches across the countryside of Ireland. This is Donegal Castle. There were so many castles in our pictures, I wasn't sure what to share with you, but Donegal is wonderful for the tourists. And down here today, this is a restaurant, but this goes back to the 1200s. Subsequently was confiscated by the English and ultimately has been repurposed now in modern day times. Parks Castle is an interesting one, and probably the plainest castle you're ever going to find in all of Ireland, but located on a wonderful river flowing by. This had been restored to almost pristine condition. This is the inside of the castle yard. And understand that many of these castles were really towns all by themselves. Here, for instance, is a cottage where one of the farm workers would live. Next to this was a craftsman's shop. Over here, the blacksmith. Their own source of water inside, so they could close the doors and pretty much exist for quite some time, as there were various storage buildings throughout. The next castle, sitting behind our daughter, is the wonderful Ashford Castle. Ashford gained great notoriety in the era of Ronald Reagan, when he traveled to Ireland and chose to stay here. Subsequently, and more important to a lot of the people in Ireland, Pierce Brosnan was married here. As we look at this castle, we see the magnificence of the grounds. The oxymoron about the place is in front of the castle sits a big helicopter pad, so the rich and famous can fly in and stay without having to travel through 1-lane and 2-lane country roads. Churches also were built across the countryside. I chose 2 to share with you because they show dramatically the difference in the lives of people that live there. Over here, we have St. Teresa's in Limerick, sort of drab looking. Looks like it needs a cleaning. Doesn't really inspire enthusiasm. And any of you who have read Angela's Ashes, which was based in Limerick, understand that this is a really Pittsburghish 1920s town. On the other hand, over here is the St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin, with a beautiful grass around it and a marvelous setting with little courtyards. And one of the interesting facts about St. Patrick's Cathedral is that it's not a Roman Catholic church, but a Protestant church. That even surprised some of our historians in here. By 1450, this shows the change in the land holdings in Ireland. It began here in the Pale. The Pale was a name given to Dublin and the areas surrounding it, and that land belonged to the King of England. These other lands down here, Desmond and Earl, both Earls out of England, the Wexford and the Lord of Wexford, the Earl of Kildare, and the Earl of Ulster represent specific areas that were handed over to various Englishmen. The rest of it is rather misleading. You will see, and those of you who know Irish names, we got the McCarthys, the O'Briens, the Burkes, the O'Flahertys, the O'Connors, the O'Rourkes, the O'Farrells, the Dempseys, etc. And these were chieftains of tribes. But because England had come in, they had to swear allegiance to the king. Otherwise, their lands were taken. In many instances, the lands were reduced significantly to provide income for the king, as well as income for Rome. As we talk about the growth in Ireland, I moved here to Dublin, and Trinity College, built in 1292, before anything ever appeared here in the United States. And the initial plan for Trinity College was that it would be modeled after Cambridge and Oxford. However, for whatever reason, it has just maintained its status as a college, even to this present time, but obviously has grown in significant numbers. Inside of Trinity College is the Trinity Library. And all the people here from the last time, raise your hand if you know what was inside the Trinity Library. Trinity Library holds the Book of Kells, considered to be one of the oldest books in the world, put together by monks somewhere between 800 and 1200 AD, and was moved around and around until it ended up here and sits right down here, wide out in the open. This picture was taken after hours. During hours, there are guards standing there, and there is a line of people, and you're allowed approximately 20 to 30 seconds to walk up, take a look at the book, which is open to one page in a hermetically sealed container, and move on. But the library itself, and think of this library was built in the 1200s, and look at the bookshelves, all the way down, both up and down. So, from earliest times, this was a significant building in Ireland. However, amazing fact, no Catholics were allowed to attend for 92 years. So they got to have our Catholic book, but they didn't want any Catholics in there to take part in it. Dublin itself blossomed. And any of you who have been in Ireland have heard the stories of the Dublin Doors. And the doors in downtown Dublin are just absolutely incredible. Look carefully here at the engravings. This is all wood carvings. Bronze and gold inlays. And there was a street of these, one door after the other, overlooking, I must say, St. Stephen's Park, which is comparable to New York City Central Park, not in size, but in significance in terms of it's the Central Park in downtown Dublin. Another city, it was booming at the time, and obviously this picture was taken not in the 1200s, but from the 12 to the 1400s. The area of Cove, pronounced C-O-V-E, even with that funny spelling. But the significance of it, and most of us would know it as the port city of Cork, which is the biggest inland harbor in all of Europe. So a huge amount of commerce took place from this location, as well as became a disembarking point for those leaving London or Ireland through the years. By 1600, you can take a different look at now the land controlled by the Ireland and the Scottish. A couple of points of interest on this map. Here is the Battle of Kinsale, taking place in 1601. And this is when two of the major chieftains in Ireland felt like they'd had enough and went down to take on the British and drive them out. It was the families of the O'Rourkes and the O'Donnells. Unfortunately for them, they were defeated easily. And one has to think, why did the Irish ever think they were going to win a battle against knights in shining armor when they had bows and arrows and spears? So after this loss, they retreated back home Up in this area, there's the O'Neills and the O'Rourke's above them. And then shortly thereafter, and you see this little indication here, flights of the Earls. This tore the heart out of Irishmen. These were their last two big leaders. And they fled the country. They first stopped in Spain to try to recruit help from the Spanish to retake some of the lands in Ireland, but the Spanish had had enough fighting with the English that they refused to help. And ultimately, both of these men traipsed across Europe and ended up in Rome, where they spent the last days of their life. Entered James I in 1603. A wonderful story. We first learned about James, who was also known as James VI in Scotland. Are there any Scots in here? No Scots. When we first visited Scotland, Christine and I stopped in this museum one day, and it was very sparsely attended. And we struck up a conversation with the guard of the place and said, what's the deal? Where is everybody? And he says, there's not a lot of people around, but next week the English are coming. Understand what happened. If you remember Braveheart and the wars for years between Scotland and England, the Scots were seeking their independence. And all of a sudden their king becomes the King of England, and the two countries now are joined together. Major bummer for the people in Scotland. However, James, knowing that, realized that he had to expand dramatically the plantation system inside of Ireland. The first step was the plantation of Ulster in the upper northeastern corner of the country that we now know as Northern Ireland. The reason it's Northern Ireland was when James expanded this plantation, he imported somewhere between 30,000 and 50,000 Scotsmen to come in and take over Irish land and drive the Irish out to wherever they could go. He continued this expansion across the countryside, appeasing, if you will, the Scots and making English people happy that they had more people agreeable to pay taxes into London. Here was the real kiss of death for the Irish. Henry VIII. Henry VIII was going along fine, had no problems with the Irish, until I guess it was his second wife that he wanted to divorce. And of course, at the time, the Roman Catholic Church had an even stricter view than it does today, which absolutely not, under no conditions are we going to allow you to get a divorce. So Henry said, that's it, I'm starting my own church, and became the head of the Church of England. Now, since he had done this, the expectation that all of his subjects, not only in England, but in Ireland, would join his church. However, very interestingly enough, for the next 40 years, Henry and his successors were preoccupied with Spain, with France, with civil strife, so they left the Irish alone. So really things were pretty good in Ireland. Yeah, they had the plantations, and some of them were working on the plantations, but the rents were reasonable. They were well fed. And you need to understand that pretty much good enough for most Irishmen. Subsequently, Charles came along. Charles represented a major threat to Parliament because Charles, the son of James, was of all things a Catholic. So Parliament was very concerned that is Charles going to make us Catholics again? With that in mind, they hired, if you will, Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell hated Catholics. And his job was to go into Ireland and exterminate any Catholic he could find. He began in a little city outside of Dublin called Drogheda. 3,500 people lived there. Catholics, Scots, English. He didn't care. He came in and massacred all of them. And proceeded to do this across the countryside. His reign of terror eliminated over 50% of the Irish Catholics living in the country. The ones that survived were hidden by Protestant friends or escaped to the western part that we saw where there were no walled towns and nobody wanted to be bothered with it. Cromwell was proclaimed a hero in England. But it's very interesting. In modern times, both Winston Churchill and Tony Blair have issued apologies, not only to the Irish, but to the world. I'm going to read here, if I have enough light, to comment from can't find it. But basically, Churchill said, all Englishmen will live forever under the curse of Cromwell. It was a devastating time. James II then came to power. James himself was really nondescript. But Parliament was concerned because he was part of that larger family. And so they realized maybe we need to do something. And James was the first person that came back to the monarchy after Cromwell. And now, here's the first one back, and they're having concerns about it. So, they decided something needs to be done to this man to get rid of him. We need to overthrow him as the king. Interesting, back then, when we went from monarchs that controlled the country to the parliaments, to then the monarchs, and now here Parliament again was saying, we gotta do something. So Parliament went out and hired William of Orange.